Immigrant Maid slept on the floor with the baby. The judge saw it. And then what happened? The home visit began as normal, but Judge Robert Harrison stopped abruptly at the door to the baby's room. At his feet, on the cold marble floor, a young woman slept wrapped in a thin blanket, with an 8-month-old child nestled in her arms. It wasn't the nanny sleeping in a comfortable bed that he had expected to find. "Sorry to disturb you, Your Excellency," whispered Margaret Whitmore, nervously adjusting the pearls on her neck. "Carmen always goes overboard with looking after little James. Sometimes she sleeps here to monitor him better." The judge watched the scene for a few more seconds. Carmen Ruiz, just 24, had immigrated from Guatemala 2 years ago, fleeing the violence that had devastated her village. She never imagined that finding work as a maid in a Connecticut mansion would become a nightmare disguised as an opportunity. The child stirred slightly, and Carmen woke instantly, her eyes meeting the judge's with a mixture of surprise and silent terror. She stood up quickly, whispering something in Spanish to the baby, who immediately calmed down in her arms. "James had a fever all night," Carmen explained in careful English, avoiding looking directly at Margaret. "He can only sleep when someone is close by. The floor, it's safer not to wake him." Margaret forced an artificial smile. Carmen is so dedicated. Sometimes we need to remind her that she has her own room in the basement. What Margaret didn't mention was that Carmen's room was a damp, windowless pantry, where she slept on a thin mattress among cleaning products and old boxes. The peeling walls dripped with moisture, and the musty smell mixed with chemical fumes made her eyes sting every night. What Margaret didn't know was that Carmen had lost her own son to fever in Guatemala, after the local clinic was closed down for lack of funds. Every night she spent protecting James was a silent promise to the son she couldn't save. Miguel would be the same age now. 3 weeks earlier, Carmen had started secretly documenting the working conditions at the Whitmore home. Not for revenge, but for survival. The 16-hour days began at 5 in the morning and ended after midnight. The insults muttered in English that they thought she didn't understand. "These people breed like rats. At least she knows her place. It would be better if she didn't speak so much Spanish around James." The promised salary of $800 a week had turned into $300, always with excuses about necessary deductions, accommodation, food, specialized training. Margaret kept Carmen's documents in a locked drawer, claiming it was for protection against theft. "Well," said the judge, watching as the baby calmed down completely in Carmen's arms, "it looks like James has an excellent carer." Margaret laughed nervously. "Yes, she's very suitable for that kind of work. These women have a natural instinct for caring, don't they?" Carmen lowered her eyes, but a spark of determination shone in her gaze. She had finished high school with honors in Guatemala, spoke 3 languages and dreamed of studying nursing before the violence destroyed her plans. Now, Margaret's every condescending word fueled something growing silently inside her. The judge made some notes on his tablet, apparently routine, but his eyes observed every detail: Carmen's pallor, the deep circles under her eyes, the way she instinctively protected the child even in the presence of the authorities. Something about the scene bothered him deeply. "Has the social services office received any complaints about this home?" he asked casually, still typing. Margaret choked slightly. "Complaints? Absolutely not. We're a respectable family, Judge Harrison. Carmen is very well looked after here." The phone hidden in Carmen's apron pocket vibrated subtly. A text message from a number she had memorized but never saved in her contacts. 3 simple words: "Time to act." As Margaret escorted the judge out of the room, Carmen remained holding James, whispering softly, "Un día pequeño to do Serra diferente." What no one in the house could have imagined was that this unexpected visit was about to trigger a series of events that would not only transform Carmen's life, but completely rewrite the rules of the game in one of Connecticut's most influential families. And that the young immigrant sleeping on the floor held secrets that would make the Whitmores lose much more than just a maid. If you've ever witnessed injustice disguised as normality, this story will touch your heart in a way you'll never forget. Subscribe to the channel to discover how a single moment of silent courage can bring down empires built on exploitation. After the judge left, Margaret closed the bedroom door more tightly than necessary. Her artificial smile disappeared instantly, revealing an expression of pure contempt. "You nearly ruined everything," she hissed between her teeth, approaching Carmen, who was still holding James. "The next time a bailiff comes here, you stay in the basement. Understand?" Carmen nodded silently, but her eyes didn't show the submission Margaret had expected. There was something different there, a calmness that bothered her. "And get these ideas out of your head," Margaret continued, nervously adjusting the pearls. "That judge won't come back to save you like in the movies. You're just an illegal immigrant doing a favor for a respectable American family." What Margaret had no idea was that Carmen had a completely legal work visa, renewed just 3 months ago. The documents were hidden in a sealed folder in the basement bedroom, along with copies of everything that really mattered. That afternoon, while Margaret went out for her traditional charity lunch at the country club, Carmen finally managed to access her real working tool, a used Android cell phone that she had secretly bought with the tip money that Margaret occasionally forgot to confiscate. The message she had received during the judge's visit had come from Elena Rodriguez, an immigration lawyer Carmen had met at a free legal aid clinic 6 months earlier. Not by chance, Elena was also the daughter of immigrants and understood exactly what families like the Whitmores were capable of doing to people like Carmen. "The documents you sent are explosive," Elena had typed. "They confirm violations of at least 8 federal labor laws. We need more evidence from the workplace, especially recordings." Carmen smiled for the first time in weeks. She had started recording conversations using the voice notes app on her cell phone since the first day Margaret called to these people in front of her friends. The phone vibrated again. A new message, this time from a different number. "Carmen, this is Dr. Harrison, family judge. Can I talk to you privately tomorrow at 2 p.m. in family court? It's about James' welfare." Carmen's heart raced. She had noticed the way he had observed every detail of the house, the way his questions were not really about James, but about herself. 2 hours later, Margaret returned from lunch slightly drunk and with a renewed fury. Apparently, one of her friends had mentioned how strange it was to have a maid sleeping on the floor with a child. "Carmen," she shouted from the main hall. "Come here right away." Carmen came downstairs holding James, who had woken up from his nap and was agitated by the shouting. "Sit down," ordered Margaret, pointing to a hard chair in the kitchen. "We need to establish some new rules." What followed was a session of systematically calculated humiliation. Carmen was only to use the basement bathroom, even at night. Her meals would be served after the family had finished eating. Her salary would be temporarily reduced to $200 a week to cover incidents, such as the judge's unexpected visit. "And another thing," Margaret continued, clearly pleased with her own cruelty. "No more sleeping in James' room. He needs to learn to manage on his own. If he cries, you come up from the basement and calm him down, but then you go back to your place." Carmen listened quietly, rocking James gently in her arms. Inside, every word was mentally filed, catalogued and dated. Margaret was building her own whistleblowing case without realizing it. "Do you understand why these changes are necessary?" Margaret asked with false concern. "It's for your own good. People like you can get confused about your role here." "Yes, Senora," Carmen replied softly. "I understand perfectly." But Margaret didn't understand that Carmen had grown up in a family where education was sacred. Her parents, rural teachers in Guatemala, had died so that she could study. Carmen spoke 4 languages, had a nursing degree and had managed a rural clinic before violence devastated her region. That night, alone in the damp basement while James wept inconsolably upstairs, Carmen turned on her tape recorder and spoke softly in Spanish. "Dia Quins. Margaret Whitmore has just violated 3 additional labor laws. James hasn't stopped crying for 40 minutes. She'd rather a child suffer than admit she needs me." The recording she didn't expect to capture came at 2 a.m., when Margaret went upstairs furious because James' screams had woken up visitors. Carmen hid the recording cell phone in her apron pocket while she went upstairs to calm the child. "I can't understand why we hired that idiot," Margaret shouted at Richard, her husband. "She was perfectly trained before, now she acts as if she has rights." "Calm down, dear," Richard muttered. "It's just a phase. If she becomes a problem, we'll simply dismiss her without references. Who's going to believe an illegal against our word?" Carmen continued recording for another 20 minutes, capturing admissions of wage evasion, plans to destroy her chances of getting another job and, above all, complete indifference to James' well-being. When she finally managed to put the baby to sleep, Carmen looked out of the bedroom window. In the house next door, a light was still on. She didn't know it, but Judge Harrison was awake too, typing up a report that would change everything: suspected labor exploitation and possible human trafficking for domestic work. Recommend immediate investigation. In the basement, Carmen opened her used laptop, another secret that Margaret didn't know about, and sent Elena an email with the day's recordings. The subject line was simple: enough evidence? The reply arrived 15 minutes later: more than enough. They don't know who they're messing with. Tomorrow, everything changes. Carmen smiled in the dark. Margaret had made the classic mistake of privileged people, assuming that someone who was more economically vulnerable was automatically less intelligent. She would soon discover that she had completely underestimated a woman who had faced wars, unimaginable losses, and now possessed both the motivation and the tools to ensure that justice was done. What those privileged people didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing its own sentence of defeat, and that the woman sleeping in the basement held an arsenal of evidence that would turn their lives into legal rubble. The meeting took place at the family court, in a small, discreet room where lawyers used to talk to clients. Carmen arrived at 2 p.m. sharp, wearing her best blouse and carrying a folder of documents that she had meticulously organized during the early hours in the basement. Judge Harrison was waiting, but not alone. Next to him, a Latina woman of about 40 stood up with a warm smile. "Carmen, this is Elena Rodriguez, a lawyer specializing in labor rights and immigration," said the judge. "She's been working on cases like yours for 15 years. Elena held out her hand. "Dr. Harrison told me about your situation. I want you to know that you're not alone." Over the next 40 minutes, Carmen presented evidence that made even Elena, experienced in exploitation cases, visibly shocked. Margaret's recordings were devastating, but the financial documents that Carmen had secretly photographed were even worse. "They withhold 75% of your salary claiming accommodation costs," Elena muttered, leafing through the papers. "That's trafficking people for forced labor. Federal crime." Carmen had discovered much more than she had imagined. While organizing papers in Margaret's office during the cleaning, she found contracts from other previous employees: Sophia, who quit after complaining about the conditions; Maria, who was discharged for theft after asking to visit her sick mother; Lucia, who simply disappeared after threatening to report the Whitmores. "How many others like you have passed through that house?" asked Dr. Harrison, clearly disturbed. "At least 6 in the last 3 years," replied Carmen. "All immigrants, all alone, all treated as disposable." Elena quickly made notes. "We're going to need to find these women. They are evidence of a systematic pattern of exploitation." 3 days later, Margaret noticed something different about Carmen. Her posture was more upright, her eyes less submissive. It irritated her deeply. "You're unusually confident for someone in your position," Margaret said over lunch with friends from the club, loud enough for Carmen, pouring champagne in the living room, to hear clearly. "Maybe I need to remind this girl of her place," laughed Victoria Pemberton, the wife of a senator. "Sometimes they forget that they're replaceable." Carmen continued serving silently, but the phone in her apron pocket recorded every poisonous word. That evening, Margaret decided to teach her a lesson. She summoned Carmen for a performance appraisal in the main living room. "Your work has been inadequate," lied Margaret, sitting down in an expensive armchair as if it were a courtroom. "Maybe it's time we looked for someone more qualified." Carmen remained calm. "What specifically needs improving?" "Your attitude," Margaret replied dryly. "You act as if you have rights here. As if you were just like us." What Margaret didn't know was that Carmen had spent the last 3 days not only collecting evidence, but studying it. Elena gave her access to the online legal library, where Carmen spent hours reading about labor rights, immigration law, and court precedents. "I see," Carmen said calmly. "May I ask if this evaluation is being formally documented?" "For labor registration purposes." Margaret blinked, confused by the specific question. "No, it's not necessary. According to Connecticut labor law, employers must document evaluations that could result in dismissal," Carmen continued, her voice maintaining its respectful tone, "especially to protect both parties." The silence was deafening. Margaret had never expected her immigrant employee to know American law. "Where did you get that information?" Margaret asked, her voice losing some of its authority. "From the library," Carmen answered simply. "I have the right to public access to education, as guaranteed by the Civil Code." In fact, Carmen had discovered something much more powerful than labor laws. During her research, she found a case filed against Richard Whitmore for tax evasion 3 years earlier. The case had been settled quietly, but the public documents showed a pattern of questionable behavior. Elena had connected Carmen with two of her ex-employees. Sophia was now working in a diner in Boston, and Maria had returned to El Salvador, but both had agreed to give evidence via video call. They did the same thing to me, Maria explained through Carmen's laptop screen. They promised full pay, then made up 1,000 excuses to withhold the money. When I complained, they accused me of stealing jewelry. Sophia confirmed an identical pattern. Margaret told me that I didn't understand American culture when I asked about time off. They know exactly how to exploit our vulnerability. Carmen now had statements, financial documents, compromising recordings, and something Margaret never suspected: connections. Elena had introduced Carmen to a network of immigrant support organizations, journalists specializing in social justice, and even other lawyers interested in the case. You're not just an isolated victim, Elena explained at an evening meeting. You're the tip of an iceberg that could expose an entire system of exploitation among wealthy Connecticut families. Dr. Harrison had done his own discreet investigation. The Whitmores have important political connections, but this also means that their fall will be much louder. Are you prepared for that? Carmen thought of Miguel, her lost son. She thought of all the women who had passed through that house before her. She thought of little James, who deserved to grow up in a family that understood the true value of compassion. More than ready, she replied with a determination that made Elena smile. The following evening, while Margaret dined with important guests discussing the immigration problem at the dinner table, Carmen quietly went upstairs to check on James. The child was sleeping peacefully, but on his bedside table there was something that hadn't been there before: a photo of Miguel, which Carmen had secretly managed to print out. "One day, little James," she murmured softly, "you will grow up in a world where people like your family will learn that dignity is not a privilege of birth." What Margaret couldn't have imagined was that her proper maid had become the main witness in a federal case that was being meticulously prepared in the shadows. And that every cruel word, every calculated humiliation, every attempt to break Carmen's spirit was being documented by a woman who had survived much worse than the arrogance of American socialites. Because sometimes, when you underestimate someone who has already lost everything once, you find out too late that they have nothing left to lose, and that makes them infinitely more dangerous than any power money can buy. Tuesday morning started normally enough for Margaret Whitmore. She was eating her imported breakfast when the doorbell rang insistently at 7:45. Carmen came downstairs carrying James, who was happily playing with a teddy bear. "Carmen, go and see who it is," ordered Margaret, irritated by the interruption. "If it's a salesman, dismiss him immediately." Carmen opened the door and feigned surprise to see 4 federal agents, 2 local detectives, and Elena Rodriguez in their best suits. "Good morning, can I help you?" "We're looking for Messrs. Margaret and Richard Whitmore," said Agent Thompson, showing his ID. "We have a search and seizure warrant related to violations of federal labor laws and possible human trafficking." The sound of a china cup shattering on the floor echoed through the mansion. Margaret had dropped her coffee, her eyes wide with shock. Richard, who was coming down the stairs straightening his tie for another normal day at work, came to a complete stop. "There must be some mistake," Margaret stammered, approaching the door. "We're a respectable family. We have nothing to do with these accusations." Elena stepped forward, her professional smile sharper than a blade. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Elena Rodriguez, a lawyer specializing in labor rights. I believe you know my client, Carmen Ruiz." Margaret's face lost all color. For the first time in years, she looked directly at Carmen, but now with growing horror rather than contempt. "Carmen." Richard muttered, confused. "What's going on here?" "What's going on," Elena said, pulling a folder out of her purse, "is that your employee has systematically documented 3 years of federal labor violations. Recordings of conversations where you admit to wage evasion, threats of deportation, confiscation of documents, and exploitation of forced labor." Carmen remained calm, still holding James, who was now paying attention to the commotion with childlike curiosity. "Can I put the baby in the crib while you work?" she asked the agents gently. "Of course," replied Agent Thompson. "Actually, we'll need to talk to you in private later." As Carmen climbed the stairs, Margaret finally exploded, That ingrate. We gave her a roof over her head. Work. Food. For $200 a week working 16 hours a day," Elena interrupted, consulting her papers. "When the federal minimum wage had demanded at least $800. And on the roof, a damp, windowless basement among chemicals. Richard tried to regain his composure. Our lawyer will be here in an hour. We won't say anything more without legal representation. Perfect, smiled Elena. Because the first hearing is scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. And we have enough evidence to support federal criminal charges. Agents began searching the house, collecting documents, computers and phones. Margaret watched in growing panic as they discovered the locked drawer with documents from previous immigrants, fraudulent contracts and financial records that confirmed the pattern of exploitation. "I've found Carmen's documents," shouted an agent from the office. "Guatemalan passport, work visa valid until 2025, nursing degree. She has higher education." Elena nodded. "Carmen is a registered nurse with a specialty in pediatrics. She speaks 4 languages fluently and managed a rural clinic before immigrating." Margaret's expression changed from panic to something close to terror. You knew how to speak perfect English the whole time?" Carmen, who had returned after accommodating James, finally spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have a master's degree in public health from the University of Guatemala. I coordinated vaccination programs for 3 provinces before the violence forced me to flee." The silence that followed was deafening. "Every insult, every humiliation, every penny stolen has been documented," Carmen continued, her voice calm but firm. "Not just against me, but against Sophia, Maria, Lucia and 5 other women who have passed through this house in the last 3 years." Richard tried one last card. "This is blackmail. She's making up these accusations." Elena laughed genuinely. "Mr. Whitmore, we have 47 hours of audio recordings where you admit to federal crimes. We have testimony from 8 former employees. We have your own financial records showing tax evasion related to non-payment of employment taxes." Margaret's phone rang. It was Victoria Pemberton, her friend from the country club. "Margaret, dear, have you seen the news? They're talking about a federal investigation into slave labor in Connecticut and—" Margaret hung up the phone with trembling hands. "The news is already on the air," Elena confirmed, consulting her own phone. "Channel 8, Channel 12, and the Hartford Courant. The headline is, 'Connecticut Elite Accused of Exploiting Immigrants as Modern-Day Slave Labor.'" Carmen watched as Margaret completely collapsed, falling into a chair and starting to cry. Not tears of regret, but of anger and self-pity. "This will ruin our reputation. The club. Richard's business." "Mrs. Whitmore," Carmen said softly, "I slept on the cold floor for 8 months to protect your son because I lost my own baby. I worked 16 hours a day for $200 because I needed to survive. I put up with your insults because I had no choice." She paused, looking straight into the eyes of the woman who had humiliated her on a daily basis. "But you did have choices. Every day, you chose cruelty when you could have chosen compassion. You chose exploitation when you could have chosen justice. These are not false accusations, Mrs. Whitmore. They are consequences." Agent Thompson returned with a box full of evidence. "Ms. Ruiz, we need you to come with us to formalize your statement. Mrs. Whitmore, you and your wife need to accompany us for questioning." As Margaret and Richard were escorted out of their own mansion, neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, reporters arrived with cameras, and sirens cut through the quiet of Connecticut's elite neighborhood. Carmen stood in the doorway, still wearing her work apron, watching as the woman who had tried to break her spirit was led to the police car in handcuffs. "Carmen," Elena whispered next to her, "how are you feeling?" Carmen thought of her son Miguel, who would never know justice. She thought of all the women like her who were still sleeping in damp basements at that very moment. She thought of little James, who would grow up knowing that his first carer had been brave enough to do what was right. "I feel that the truth finally has a voice," she replied, "and that sometimes the price of dignity is having the patience to document each injustice until it can no longer be ignored." But what Carmen didn't yet know was that that day would mark only the beginning of a transformation that would change not only her life, but create ripples of change throughout the system that allowed families like the Whitmores to operate their little domestic tyrannies without consequence. Because sometimes a single brave voice is all the world needs to remind it that justice delayed is still justice. 6 months later, Carmen Ruiz was sitting at a glass table in the Rodriguez and Associates law office, not as a client, but as a partner specializing in immigrant rights. Her master's degree in public health, now duly validated in the United States, adorned the wall next to a photo of her receiving a Human Rights Award from the governor of Connecticut. The transformation had been so complete that journalists were still seeking interviews about the nurse who brought down a Connecticut dynasty. The Whitmore case had become legal precedent, resulting in the creation of new labor laws that specifically protected immigrant domestic workers. Elena entered the room carrying a briefcase and a satisfied smile. Margaret has just accepted the final settlement. $400,000 in compensation for you, plus $50,000 for each of the 8 ex-employees we found. Carmen nodded calmly. Money had never been the main objective, but it would ensure that all the women exploited by the Whitmores could rebuild their lives with dignity. "What about little James?" asked Carmen, as she did every week. "With his paternal aunt in Boston." Apparently, she always suspected Margaret, but never had the courage to act. Now she's suing to gain permanent custody. The irony was almost poetic. Margaret, who had humiliated Carmen by saying that she would never be a mother to James, had lost the very right to be called a mother. The juvenile court ruled that her environment of domestic exploitation made her unsuitable to care for a child. Across town, Margaret Whitmore was sweeping floors in a New Haven diner, the only job she could get after the federal indictments completely destroyed her social reputation. Richard had moved to Arizona, broke and divorced, working as an insurance broker in a town where no one knew his name. The country club had canceled his membership. His socialite friends changed the subject when someone mentioned his name. The Connecticut mansion was auctioned off to pay legal debts and federal fines. "You know what the best part was?" Elena laughed, flipping through documents. "Victoria Pemberton, that snobby friend of hers, came to me last week. Apparently, her maid also started recording conversations." Carmen smiled. The case had created a wave of denunciations throughout the region. Wealthy families who once felt untouchable now treated employees with almost excessive care, knowing that a single recording could destroy decades of social prestige. Dr. Harrison had become a powerful ally, using his judicial influence to accelerate changes in the system. "Carmen demonstrated that courage doesn't have to shout to be heard," he said during an interview. "Sometimes the most powerful justice comes from strategic silence." 3 weeks later, Carmen was at the airport, flying to Guatemala for the first time in 3 years. But now she wasn't fleeing violence. She was returning to open a rural clinic financed with part of the Whitmore compensation. The project would offer free medical care and training in labor rights for women considering immigrating. "Every woman I can teach to document abuse is a Margaret Whitmore who won't be able to repeat her crimes," she told the TV cameras at the airport. The circle was closing perfectly. The money that Margaret had used to humiliate and exploit was now funding dignity and education for women just like Carmen had been. On the flight, Carmen opened an envelope Elena had given her. Inside was a handwritten letter from James, now 2, to his new guardian. "Thank you for looking after me when I was little. Mama Maria, his aunt, said that you always protected me. One day when I grow up, I want to help people like you helped me." The tears came silently. Miguel, her lost son, would never have the chance to write a letter like that. But somehow, through James, her memory had found a way to live on. In first class, an upgrade she could now afford, Carmen reflected on the most important lesson of the whole experience. The most devastating revenge had not been to destroy Margaret Whitmore. It had been to turn every act of cruelty into fuel to build something bigger and more meaningful than any humiliation. Margaret tried to break her spirit by calling her fit only to serve. Carmen responded by becoming one of Connecticut's most respected human rights lawyers. Margaret said that people like her breed like rats. Carmen responded by creating programs that would educate hundreds of women about their rights and dignity. Margaret insisted that Carmen would never be anything but a maid. Carmen responded by building a legacy that would protect future generations of women from the exploitation she had suffered. As the plane took off for Guatemala, Carmen smiled thinking about the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge destroys only the enemy. Justice transforms the whole world around the problem. Margaret Whitmore lost everything because she chose to see Carmen as disposable. Carmen won everything because she chose to see injustice as transformable. The best revenge, Carmen discovered, was not to make Margaret suffer. It was to ensure that no woman ever had to sleep on the floor of a mansion to protect her child from someone who despised her for her origin. If you've ever faced injustices that seemed impossible to overcome, remember this story. Sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating those who have wronged us, but using that pain to build bridges so that others don't have to cross the same chasms. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that dignity won with intelligence always wins out over privilege inherited with cruelty.